The night did not bring silence. It brought the sound of engines. It was an October night in 1952, the kind of heavy, suffocating darkness that settles over the Kenyan highlands before the rains. Inside the mud-walled homes of the Kikuyu people, families slept with one ear pressed against the earth, sensing a tremor that was not seismic, but political. Then the illusion of peace was shattered. The roar of heavy trucks tore through the silence. Headlights cut through the darkness like searchlights in a prison yard. Boots heavy, military boots, slammed against the hard-packed red soil. This was the beginning of Operation Jock Scott. Soldiers, their faces masked by the shadows of their helmets, burst into homes across the country. Doors were kicked off hinges. Shouts in English mixed with the terrified cries of women and children. Men were dragged from their beds, confused and disoriented, illuminated by the harsh glare of flashlights before being thrown into the backs of waiting trucks. It was a synchronized strike, a masterclass in colonial efficiency, designed to decapitate a movement before the sun rose over Nairobi. But what began as a police operation that night would metastasize into something far darker, something that would stain the conscience of the British Empire for decades to come. This was not merely a crackdown, it was the prologue to a tragedy of staggering proportions. The British administration, presenting itself to the world as a beacon of civilization and law, was about to unleash a machinery of repression that would rival the darkest regimes of the 20th century. In the years that followed that fateful October night, the verdant landscapes of Kenya were scarred by a network of detention centers and barbed wire. The scale of this tragedy is difficult to comprehend, yet the numbers speak with a cold, undeniable precision. More than 160,000 Kenyans would eventually pass through these British camps. 160,000 lives. These were not just combatants or political agitators. They were farmers, teachers, fathers, and sons, swept up in a dragnet so vast it threatened to swallow an entire population. For over half a century, the true nature of what happened behind those fences remained a ghost story, whispered in Kikuyu villages, but steadfastly ignored in the halls of Westminster. The narrative sold to the world was one of a benevolent empire restoring order against savagery. The reality was a systematic dismantling of human dignity. For decades, this chapter of history was effectively erased. It became the empire's forgotten genocide, buried under a mountain of bureaucratic denial. The British government, successive administration after successive administration, maintained a wall of silence. They claimed that the reports of brutality were exaggerated, that the detention pipeline was a humane effort at rehabilitation, and most crucially, that no documentation existed to prove otherwise. Historians and survivors who sought the truth were met with stone-faced denials. The official line was clear. There were no files, no records, no smoking gun. This wall of denial stood firm until 2011. It crumbled not because of a change of heart, but because of a discovery that could no longer be suppressed. Hidden away in the depths of a highly secure government facility at Hanslope Park, a location far removed from the red dust of Kenya's secret archives, were unearthed. These were not mere administrative papers. They were the migrated archives, a treasure trove of damning evidence that had been concealed from the public eye. Among these thousands of documents were the files of Operation Legacy, a covert scheme designed to curate history by hiding the empire's dirty laundry. The discovery of these files changed everything. The documents provided incontrovertible proof of what the Kikuyu survivors had been saying for 60 years. The system was built on cruelty. The files revealed that the colonial administration was not only aware of the brutality, but sanctioned it. The veneer of civilized rule was stripped away, revealing a cold, calculated apparatus of terror. The weight of this evidence forced a reckoning that had been delayed for generations. In 2012, in a historic turn of events within the High Court in London, the British government was finally compelled to drop its facade. The denial that had persisted for nearly 60 years evaporated in the face of the yellowing pages found at Hanslope Park. The government formally admitted that torture took place. It was a sterile phrase for a horrific reality, but it was an admission nonetheless. That admission marked the end of the silence, but it was only the beginning of the understanding. As we look back at the 160,000 souls who walked through the gates of those camps, we must peel back the layers of history that Operation Legacy tried to hide. To understand the horror of the 1950s, we must first understand the darkness of that October night in 1952, when the soldiers kicked down the doors and the civilizing mission revealed its true, brutal face. To understand the fury that would eventually engulf Kenya, one must look not at the politics of the 1950s, but at the soil itself. The story of the uprising is written in the red, fertile earth of the central highlands land that, for centuries, had been the lifeblood of the Kikuyu people. But the narrative of dispossession began long before the first shot was fired, tracing its origins back to 1895 with the arrival of the white settlers. For the British Empire, Kenya was a jewel, a place where the climate was mild and the soil rich enough to build fortunes. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, a systematic seizure of territory took place. The colonial administration drew lines on maps that severed the indigenous population from their heritage. By the dawn of the 1950s, the transformation was complete and devastating. The British settlers, a tiny minority of the population, controlled the White Highlands, the most arable, productive land in the country. The Kikuyu, once the masters of these hills, were reduced to squatters on their own ancestral grounds, or forced into overcrowded reserves where the earth was exhausted and unable to feed the growing families. This was not merely an economic displacement, it was a spiritual dislocation. For the Kikuyu, land was not a commodity. It was the resting place of ancestors and the guarantee of the future. By taking the land, the empire had taken their blood. As the pressure in the reserves mounted, a new and terrifying force began to coalesce in the shadows of the forests and the slums of Nairobi. It was a movement born of desperation, bound by secrecy and known to the world as the Mau Mau. To the colonial administrators, sipping gin on the verandas of their stolen estates, the movement was incomprehensible, a descent into savagery that threatened the very order of civilization. Rumors began to drift from the servants' quarters to the masters' dining tables, whispers of strange nocturnal gatherings that terrified the colonizers. The British psyche was deeply unsettled by reports of the Mau Mau oaths. These were not simple political pledges. They were rumored to be dark, binding rituals involving sacrifices and magic, elements that tapped into a primal fear within the European community. The colonizers spoke of these ceremonies with a mix of revulsion and dread, convinced that they were facing a force that was not just rebellious, but demonic. The reality of these nights was intense and visceral. Imagine a clearing deep in the forest, shielded from the prying eyes of the colonial police by a canopy of ancient trees. The air is thick with the smoke of a fire and the smell of raw meat. In the flickering light, new recruitsmen and women who had lost everything to the settlers step forward. They are stripped of their Western clothes, stripped of the identity forced upon them by the colony. Before them stands an arch constructed from goatskin and banana leaves. To pass through this arch is to cross a threshold from which there is no return. As they partake in the ritual, consuming the meat and swearing absolute unity, they bind themselves to the cause and to each other. It was a ceremony designed to conquer fear, creating a solidarity so fierce that it could withstand the might of an empire. For years, the British intelligence services had received warnings. District officers and loyalist chiefs had sent reports up the chain of command, detailing the simmering rage and the spreading influence of the oath-takers. Yet, the government in Nairobi remained paralyzed by arrogance, dismissing the warnings as the grumblings of ungrateful subjects. They believed the native mind was incapable of organized insurrection. That illusion of control was shattered by a single act of violence that would serve as the spark for the coming inferno. On October 9, 1952, Senior Chief Waruhu, a prominent Kikuyu leader who had staunchly supported the colonial government and denounced the Mau Mau, was ambushed. He was shot dead in his car in broad daylight, a brazen assassination that sent shockwaves through the settler community. The murder of Chief Waruhu was the turning point. For the British, this was the final proof that the situation had spiraled beyond the control of normal policing. It became the formal pretext for the iron-fisted repression that was to follow. However, historians now recognize that this was a tragedy foretold. The assassination was not a sudden aberration, but the inevitable eruption of a volcano that had been rumbling for decades, ignored by a government that chose to close its eyes to the theft of land and the spilling of blood, until the blood spilled was that of their own allies. The stage was set for a war that would be fought without mercy. October 20th, 1952, the day the hunt began. The tension that had been suffocating the colony finally snapped with the stroke of a pen. In the opulent isolation of Government House, Governor Evelyn Baring made the decision that would irrevocably alter the course of Kenyan history. On October 20th, 1952, he signed the proclamation declaring a state of emergency. To the outside world, it was a legal measure to restore order. In reality, it was a declaration of war against an entire people. It was the signal that the veneer of civil administration had been stripped away, replaced by the raw machinery of martial law. The reaction was immediate and devastatingly choreographed. The British administration believed that the Mau Mau was a hydra with a single head, and they intended to cut it off before the sun rose. Operation Jock Scott, the plan that had been lying in wait, was unleashed with ruthless efficiency. The dawn of October 21st broke not with the sounds of waking birds, but with the grinding of gears and the shouting of orders. In Nairobi and the surrounding reserves, the hunt was on. The artistic brutality of the moment was etched into the memory of the city. Heavily armed convoys of military trucks rumbled through the unpaved streets, kicking up clouds of red dust that hung in the air like a bloody mist. Soldiers, nerves on edge, and fingers on triggers, cordoned off entire neighborhoods. They were looking for the agitators, the voices that had dared to speak against the crown. By the time the morning light fully illuminated the chaos, the British dragnet had hauled in 180 key leaders of the independence movement. Among them was a man whose name would become synonymous with Kenyan freedom, Jomo Kenyatta. The future president was dragged from his home, accused of managing the Mau Mau society, a charge the British were desperate to pin on him to delegitimize the political struggle. These men were not taken to courthouses to face charges. They were thrown into the back of trucks, the dust coating their faces, destined for remote detention centers in the northern deserts. The rationale behind these mass arrests revealed a chilling mindset within the colonial administration. Whispers circulated through the settler clubs and administrative offices, rumors that hinted at a terrifying objective. The British were not merely trying to catch criminals. They were planning what some privately termed a final solution to the Kikuyu problem. This sentiment was confirmed by the legal void that opened up that day. Mass arrests were conducted without specific charges, without trials, and without end dates. The goal was to sweep up the entire political class of the Kikuyu people and lock them away until their spirit was broken. However, the empire had made a fatal miscalculation. They believed that by arresting the known political leaders, the men in suits like Kenyatta, they would decapitate the movement and watch the body wither. They were wrong. Instead of extinguishing the fire, the crackdown poured gasoline on it. The arrest of the moderates left a vacuum that was quickly filled by the militants, the hardliners who had no faith in negotiation. The operation did not break the Mau Mau. It drove them into the wild. Thousands of young men and women, realizing that the cities were now death traps, fled the reserves. They vanished into the dense, bamboo-shrouded slopes of the Aberdare Combat Range and the forests of Mount Kenya. Among them was the legendary Dedan Kimathi, a man who would transform from a clerk into the elusive field marshal of the forest armies. Under the canopy of the Aberdares, where the British trucks could not follow, the resistance regrouped. The British had started a hunt, believing it would be a short, sharp police action. Instead, they had unwittingly initiated a brutal guerrilla war. The dust settling on the roads of Nairobi that morning did not mark the end of the insurrection. It marked the beginning of a long, bloody nightmare. The Pipeline, Architecture of Horror, 1953-1954. As the insurgency dug into the forests, the British response evolved from chaotic raids into a cold, industrialized system of mass incarceration. This was not merely a collection of prisons. It was a psychological assembly line designed to process human beings, strip them of their ideology, and remold them into obedient subjects. They called it the Pipeline. The architect of this initial concept was Thomas Asquith, a colonial official who envisioned a program of rehabilitation and re-education. On paper, the plan appeared almost clinical. A vast network was constructed, eventually expanding to more than 100 detention camps scattered across the country. The system was designed to filter the Kikuyu population through a series of stages, moving them down the pipeline toward eventual release, but only if they confessed, renounced the Mau Mau oath, and submitted to colonial authority. To manage the tens of thousands of detainees, the British implemented a rigid classification system based on colour, reducing human complexity to a simple threat assessment. Detainees were branded as white, cooperative and safe, grey, undecided or fearful, or black, the hardcore loyalists to the movement. The destination of a detainee determined their fate. While the white camps offered a semblance of leniency, the black camps were abysses where the British Empire abandoned all pretense of law. The system was soon overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the repression. In April 1954, the colonial government launched Operation Anvil, a massive military sweep that turned Nairobi into a zone of terror. The capital was sealed off, sectors were cordoned with barbed wire, and the entire African population was screened. In a matter of weeks, tens of thousands of Kikuyu were rounded up from the city and dumped into the mouth of the pipeline. The camps were bursting at the seams, and the rehabilitation process stalled against the unwavering defiance of the hardcore detainees who refused to confess. Faced with this resistance, the philosophy of the camps darkened significantly. The pretense of education gave way to the brutal pragmatism of Terence Gavigan, a colonial officer who would become the master of the system's darkest mechanics. Gavigan developed and implemented what became known as the dilution technique. The theory was chillingly simple. To break the solidarity of the hardcore detainees, their will had to be shattered through force before they could be diluted back into the general population of cooperative prisoners. This was no longer rehabilitation. It was systematic psychological and physical demolition. Under Gavigan's direction, the process involved a mixture of unrelenting physical torture and acute psychological terror designed to induce a shock that would force submission. Guards were authorized to use overwhelming force to compel obedience. The camps became arenas where the human spirit was tested against the boot and the baton. The reality of what happened inside the pipeline was known to those running it, even if they hid it from the public. In the dusty, secret files of the colonial administration, the mask slipped. One warden, documenting the implementation of these techniques, noted with chilling detachment that the methods required to break the Mau Mau were not for the squeamish. It was an understatement that belied the horror. The pipeline had been built to process people, but by 1954, it had transformed into a machine designed to grind them down, serving as the gateway to the specific, intimate violences that would define the British legacy in Kenya. Torture chambers, methods of re-education. If the pipeline was the skeleton of the detention system, the interrogation rooms were its bloody heart. Within these walls, the euphemisms of the colonial administration words like rehabilitation, screening, and cooperation evaporated instantly. They were replaced by a reality so visceral and sadistic that it defies the sanitized history books of the empire. The goal was no longer merely to detain, it was to shatter the human being completely, physically and psychologically, until the Mau Mau virus was expunged. The methods employed were not the actions of rogue soldiers losing their temper in the heat of battle. They were calculated, repetitive, and often documented. The toolkit of the British wardens was filled with mundane objects turned into instruments of unimaginable pain. Consider the pliers. A tool designed for fencing and mechanics became a symbol of the emasculation of the Kikuyu men. In the dusty, blood-stained corners of the camps, wardens used them to castrate detainees who refused to give up information or renounce their oaths. This was not a myth. It was a lived reality for men like Paulo Nzili. Years later, In a world that had tried to forget him, Nzili would stand as a living testament to this barbarity, eventually receiving compensation in 2013 for the irreversible mutilation he suffered. But in the 1950s, he was just one of many, screaming in a room while a warden held a pair of pliers, enforcing the empire's will on his body. The violence was not limited to men. The British colonial machine, often romanticized as a gentlemanly endeavor, waged a gendered war against Kikuyu women, kept in separate facilities such as the notorious Gitamayu camp, which began operations in the late 50s. Women were subjected to specific gender-based terror. The re-education here frequently took the form of sexual violence. There are harrowing records of women being raped not just by guards, but with foreign objects, including glass bottles. It was a method designed to humiliate and destroy the social fabric of the Kikuyu community by violating the sanctity of its mothers and daughters. Beyond the specific atrocities of castration and sexual assault, there was a baseline of brutality that defined daily life in the camps. Beating a man to death was not an uncommon occurrence. It was a hazard of the environment. For those who survived the beatings, there were other degrading techniques. The boot on the throat became a standard posture of authority, a literal suppression of breath and voice. Prisoners were forced to eat mud and dirt, a mocking punishment that twisted their demand for land and freedom into a cruel joke. If they wanted the land so badly, they would be made to consume it until they choked. While many methods were documented, others exist in the terrifying realm of survivor memory and persistent rumor, their paper trails likely destroyed. In camps like Aguthi, whispers spoke of water torture. It was said that detainees were held in flooded cells, rooms where the water level was kept high enough to prevent sitting or lying down, denying the prisoner sleep for days on end until madness set in. While the official files on these water cells are scarce, the consistency of the accounts paints a picture of a system that was constantly innovating new ways to inflict suffering. The artistic sketch of this era is painted in grim colors. A warden standing over a prostrate figure, pliers or a baton in hand. The air filled with the metallic smell of blood and the dry, choking dust of the camp. The screams that were ignored by officers writing reports on progress in the next room. This was the reality of British re-education, a system where the price of survival was the surrender of one's soul. Villagization, concentration camps, under the open sky. While the pipeline was designed to break the individual, the British administration simultaneously launched a strategy to break the community. Beginning in 1954, the colonial government initiated a policy with a deceptively benign name, villagization. To the bureaucratic mind, it was a tactical necessity designed to sever the supply lines between the rural population and the Mau Mau fighters in the forests. To the Kikuyu people, it was the transformation of their homeland into a prison state. In a staggering logistical operation, more than 1 million Kikuyu were forcibly uprooted from their scattered homesteads. Their traditional homes were burned to the ground, and families were herded into centralized, fortified compounds. These were villages in name only. In reality, they were concentration camps under the open sky. The architecture of these settlements was defined by containment. Each village was surrounded by deep trenches and spiked moats ringed with barbed wire and watched over by armed guards in watchtowers. The freedom to move, to farm, to live was extinguished. Inside these wires, the social fabric of the Kikuyu was torn apart. The men were largely absent, stripped away to work in the forced labor gangs of the pipeline or fighting in the forests. The villages became holding pens for women, children, and the elderly A population left vulnerable and defenseless. Life behind the wire was a slow attrition of dignity. Families who had once lived on the fertile slopes were packed into tiny huts in sanitary conditions that deteriorated rapidly. Rumors drifted out from these enclosures, whispers of rampant disease and gnawing hunger that stalked the muddy lanes between the huts. Dysentery and malnutrition became the silent wardens of the villages, while the British kept meticulous records of the terrorists they killed in combat. The statistics of those who perished from neglect and starvation in these villages were conveniently obscured, hidden in the fog of the emergency. The legacy of this mass incarceration is not just a chapter in a history book, it is physically embedded in the Kenyan landscape. The British built these camps to last, and when the barbed wire was finally rolled up, the foundations remained. It is a chilling, little-known fact that today, the echoes of this trauma resonate in the most innocent of places. Many modern Kenyan schools were constructed directly on top of the sites of former detention camps and fortified villages. Consider Aguthi, once a place of notorious brutality where the air was heavy with fear and pain. It is now the site of a secondary school. Today, children run and play on the same ground where their grandfathers were tortured and their grandmothers were held captive. The classrooms stand where the interrogation cells once were. The laughter of a new generation rings out over soil that was once soaked in blood. It is a haunting juxtaposition, a country building its future literally on top of the buried, unresolved crimes of its colonial past. Mobile gallows, the industry of death. While the camps were designed to crush the soul, the colonial administration required a more definitive instrument to crush the body. Between 1952 and 1958, the British justice system in Kenya transformed into a veritable assembly line of capital punishment. In a campaign of calculated lethality, 1,090 people were executed. This figure is staggering, representing a rate of hanging that eclipsed any other British colonial conflict. But the horror lay not just in the numbers, but in the methodology. The British did not merely want to kill the terrorists. They wanted to make a spectacle of their death. To achieve maximum intimidation, the administration devised a macabre innovation: the mobile gallows. These were not fixed structures hidden behind prison walls. They were machines of death mounted on the back of heavy trucks, designed to travel into the heart of the reserves. Justice, or what passed for it, was brought directly to the people's doorstep. The arrival of these caravans became a recurring nightmare for the Kikuyu villages. The artistic sketch of these mornings is etched in grim, cinematic detail. It usually began at dawn. The silence of the village would be broken by the groan of a heavy engine approaching through the mist. A military truck would roll into the central clearing, the wooden structure on its flatbed towering over the thatched roofs of the huts. The villagers were not allowed to hide. Men, women, and children were dragged from their homes and forced to gather in the square. They were compelled to witness the power of the empire. A heavy silence would fall over the crowd, broken only by the creaking of wood and the sound of the noose swaying in the morning wind. The victim, often a neighbor or a relative, would be led up the steps. The drop was public, a visceral performance of state power intended to traumatize the onlookers into submission. Behind this theatrical brutality lay a legal system that had been stripped of all fairness. The rule of law was a hollow shell. Many of those who climbed the steps of the mobile gallows had been condemned without anything resembling a proper trial. In the haste to suppress the rebellion, the judicial process was accelerated to a breakneck speed. Sentences of death were often handed down in a matter of hours, with the accused having little to no legal representation. The distance between arrest and the noose was terrifyingly short. The British understood exactly what they were doing. The mobile gallows were a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. There is a dark anecdote from the era that encapsulates this mindset perfectly. A British soldier, reflecting on the campaign, later admitted that the sight of the gallows was more effective than tanks in suppressing the morale of the population. A tank could destroy a house, but the mobile gallows, rolling into a village at sunrise, destroyed the belief that resistance was possible. It was an industry of death, efficient and public, designed to hang the shadow of fear over every village in the Central Highlands. March 3rd, 1959. The massacre at Hola. The sun over the Tana River district burns with an unforgiving intensity. But on March 3rd, 1959, the heat was matched only by the brutality of men. The scene at the Hola detention camp remains the single most defining image of the British endgame in Kenya, a tableau of absolute horror etched into the arid landscape. 11 bodies lay motionless in the dust, baking under the relentless glare of the midday sun. Standing over them were the camp guards, their chests heaving from exertion, their heavy wooden batons gripped tightly in sweating hands. These men were not casualties of a riot or a breakout attempt. They were the victims of a specific, calculated order to force compliance. That morning, a contingent of hardcore detainees had refused to perform forced labor digging irrigation ditches in the hard, unyielding earth. The camp administration decided to break their defiance with brute force. What followed was not discipline, it was a massacre. The guards were unleashed upon the unarmed prisoners, beating them systematically until the movement ceased. In the immediate aftermath, the colonial propaganda machine attempted one of its most audacious cover-ups. The official press release issued from Nairobi was a masterpiece of deceit. It claimed that the 11 men had died after drinking contaminated water from a water cart. It was a convenient, sanitized explanation designed to absolve the administration of any wrongdoing. They hoped the remoteness of Hola would keep the truth buried in the desert sand. However, the dead speak. The deception crumbled the moment the bodies were examined. The autopsies provided a catalogue of violence that no amount of bureaucratic spinning could hide. The medical reports were gruesome and indisputable. The men had not died of poison or thirst. They had died of shock and hemorrhage. Their bodies were broken, fractured jaws, shattered kneecaps, and severe internal bleeding caused by repeated blunt force trauma. The contaminated water was a lie. The truth was murder. The scandal was too large to contain within the colony. It travelled all the way to the Palace of Westminster, shaking the British Parliament to its core. For the first time, the visceral reality of the colonial Gulag was laid bare for the British public. Yet even in the face of such undeniable evidence, the culture of impunity held firm. In a shocking display of injustice, no camp commandant, no guard, and no government official faced criminal charges or punishment for the killings. The official response from the government was chilling in its dismissal. The colonial secretary, facing the uproar, famously characterized the massacre as a regrettable but isolated incident. It was a phrase meant to minimize the systemic nature of the violence, reducing a massacre to a mere administrative hiccup. But history would prove that Hola was not just an incident. It was the turning point. It became the last straw for the colonial project. The sheer savagery of the event destroyed the last vestiges of Britain's moral claim to rule Kenya. It galvanized the opposition and horrified the international community. Far from crushing the spirit of independence, the blood spilled at Hola accelerated it. It signaled that the cost of maintaining the empire had become too high, both in currency and in conscience. The road to decolonization was now paved with the lives of the Hola 11. Operation Legacy. Burning the evidence. 1960-1963. As the winds of change swept across Africa and the Union, Jack prepared to descend over Nairobi for the final time. The British administration embarked on one last, covert mission. It was not a military offensive, but a bureaucratic purge. Between 1960 and 1963, as independence became inevitable, colonial officials launched Operation Legacy. The objective was cold and precise: to sanitize history. They intended to erase the footprints of their crimes before the new Kenyan government could take power. Across the colony, incinerators roared to life. In the backyards of police stations, district offices, and detention camps, the evidence of a decade of brutality was fed into the flames. The British were systematically destroying the paper trail, the intelligence reports, the interrogation logs, and the administrative orders that detailed the torture and murder of the Mau Mau era. The air was thick with the smoke of burning secrets. Rumors have long persisted that the scale of this destruction was immense, with the number of documents reduced to ash, far exceeding those that were eventually preserved. The true extent of what was lost, the names of every victim, the specific identities of every torturer vanished into the sky, creating a permanent void in the historical record. However, not everything was burned. A select portion of the most sensitive material was deemed too important to destroy, but too damning to leave behind. These files were spirited away, flown back to Britain in diplomatic bags and buried deep within the archives of the Foreign Office. For 50 years, the British government denied their existence, maintaining the fiction that all relevant records had been handed over to the Kenyan government at independence. The wall of silence finally cracked in 2011. In a shocking revelation, a secret cache was discovered at Hanslope Park, a high-security government facility in the English countryside. The find was staggering: 8,800 files from 37 former colonies, hidden from historians, the public, and the courts. These were the migrated archives, the smoking gun that proved the systematic nature of colonial violence. The discovery of these documents fundamentally shifted the scales of justice. In 2012, 4 elderly Kenyans, including Paulo Nzili, who had survived the horror of castration, brought a landmark case against the British government. Armed with the undeniable proof found in the Hanslope Park files, they shattered the decades of denial. The weight of the evidence forced a capitulation. In 2013, the British government agreed to an out-of-court settlement, paying out $19.9 million to 5,228 surviving victims of the torture camps. Along with the compensation came a statement of unprecedented significance. While stopping short of full legal liability, the statement read to the court admitted the terrible truth. The government does not defend the actions of the colonial administration. It was a victory for memory over erasure, proving that while Operation Legacy had burned the paper, it could not extinguish the truth. Epilogue: Scars that do not heal. The official calendars mark the end of the state of emergency in 1960. In the administrative records of the British Empire, this date signifies the restoration of order and the closure of a turbulent chapter. But for the human beings who walked out of the detention centres, the nightmare did not adhere to bureaucratic timelines. The barbed wire was rolled up and the watchtowers were dismantled, yet the consequences of those years continue to ripple through the generations. The true legacy of the camps is found in the quiet, private moments of modern Kenya. Picture an elderly man sitting in the fading light of his home. He rolls up his sleeve, revealing the jagged, raised skin on his arm, a map of pain etched by a colonial blade or a pair of pliers decades ago. Beside him sits his grandson, eyes wide, listening to a history that was almost scrubbed from the textbooks. The old man is passing down the memory of a story that Operation Legacy tried to burn. He shows his scars not as a badge of victimhood, but as proof of existence against a system that tried to erase him. Today, the survivors live with physical and psychological traumas that have never fully healed. The compensation paid in 2013 provided a measure of financial relief for some, but it could not buy back the years lost or the dignity stolen. For many, justice remains elusive. While the British government admitted that torture took place and paid out millions, there remains a gaping hole in the reconciliation process. Britain has never offered a full, unequivocal official apology for the systematic crimes committed in Kenya. The language used has been one of regret, carefully calibrated by lawyers, rather than the profound contrition the victims deserve. Moreover, the full truth may still be hidden. Despite the revelations of the Hanslope Park discovery, shadows linger in the archives. Rumors persist among historians and survivors that unclassified materials detailing the most sadistic and depraved episodes of the repression remain locked away, shielded from public view by the Official Secrets Act. The story of the British Gulag in Kenya is known, but perhaps not fully told. The camps are gone, but the scars both on the skin of the elderly and the soul of the nation do not heal. They remain as a permanent, living testament to the forgotten crimes of the empire.